This afternoon, I'm hoping to conclude our study on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, realizing the beauty of marriage and the blessedness that God has bestowed upon man of this wonderful institution. Marriage is the joining of man and woman together by God as husband and wife. That's the very basic idea of marriage. There must be in a marriage the decision by both parties, man and woman, to be married. And both parties, the man and the woman, must be eligible for marriage. In other words, when we say eligible, we're talking about them meeting God's requirements. And there's three categories in relationship to that. One who's never been married, one who has lost their mate through death, and then one who has put away their mate for fornication. The one who puts away their mate has the right to get married. The one who has been put away has not, or is not. Then, because we are to obey the laws of the land, we must obey those laws. And whatever those laws of our society at that time state, then we need to obey those laws, as long as, of course, they are harmonious with God's law. And then God joins them together as husband and wife. And Matthew 19 and verse 6, "What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." And the idea there of that last phrase, "let not man put asunder," is that man might attempt to put it asunder, but he cannot accomplish it. Why? Because God is joining them together, and only God is the one who can unjoin them. Thus, when we come to divorce, divorce is something which God hates. There's always sin involved in divorce. Whether it is a scriptural divorce or whether it's not a scriptural divorce, there's always sin that's involved. But, as we stated, God does the joining, only God can do the unjoining. He gives us thus the general law, for example, in Luke 16 and verse 18, "Whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her that is put away from her husband commits adultery." So if two eligible people marry, they get a divorce, and that divorce is not for fornication. They go marry someone else, they're committing adultery. And we'll add here that they must get out of that adultery in order to be pleasing to God. There's no other way about it. The exception to that general law is found in verse 9 of Matthew 19. "Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication." So there's the exceptive clause. And then he goes on, "Shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery." So the exceptive clause means that if they put the maid away for fornication, and they marry adultery, or they marry another, they are not committing adultery. They have the right to get married again. So that's the exception to that general rule. We've been looking at scenarios and questions that have been submitted. I'm going to deal with three of them. Just leave that, try to. We're going to deal with three of them this afternoon, and that should be the conclusion of these lessons. An eligible couple marry. One of them commits fornication. The non-guilty puts away the fornicator. The question is, the non-guilty obviously has the right to get married, but do they have the right to reconcile? And I'll use reconcile in this situation. recognizing that it is not the proper word because they are not reconciling, they would be marrying again. Does the guilty fornicator, or the guilty fornicator, does not have the right to get married? They do not have authority from God to get married. But there's an exception to that, it seems to me. Some, and very good scholarly brethren, have looked at that situation and said because that fornicator was put away, then they no longer have that right to get married, period. But God has obviously unjoined them because that one who is not guilty of fornication put away the guilty fornicator. So God has unjoined them according to Matthew 19 and verse 9. But the question is, when you look at this verse, I'm going to try and get it up here. Whosoever put away his wife. Now we looked at the exceptive clause, except it be for fornication, and marry another, committeth adultery. Why is that word another there? That's a question which must be answered. Jesus didn't say something simply to hear his mouth flopping open, and every word means something. Every word is inspired of God. If you omit the word another and you read it, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and marry, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. Then that would exclude that guilty party, or that reconciliation by those two individuals, or the marrying again of those two individuals. But Jesus didn't say that. Jesus put the word another there. He included it for some reason. The only reason, and I've asked this of brethren who hold the view that they cannot get remarried because of the one being a guilty fornicator, why did Jesus use the word another? And I have not yet found anyone to even really attempt to answer the question. Because there is no answer as with what I would say. Thus, by marrying the same one, you'd not be committing adultery. And thus they would have that right to reconcile. And again, that's not the proper term because God has unjoined them. They have the right to marry each other again and not commit adultery. Otherwise, you have to deal with that word another. And just there's no way in which it can be done. Another scenario that's been put up and that often is discussed when you're dealing with divorce and remarriage is that what if a person's in an abusive relationship? May that person divorce their mate then? Not to minimize the abusive situation in any way. That is an ungodly situation. And it certainly makes it difficult on both parties. But abuse is not the exception that God gives to the marriage law. I mean, we might want it to be, but it's not there. There is no abusive relationship in relationship to this marriage law and the exception to it. Does that answer the question fully, though? No. There might be the need to take advantage of the legal system. for the protection of the individual. Do we have biblical precedent for such? Yes, we do. Paul took advantage, for example, of the legal system for his own protection. If you turn over to Acts, the 22nd chapter, Paul has been arrested in a sense. There was a great commotion, and the chief captain goes down and rescues Paul, and he's going to examine him to find out, why are you causing this commotion? What's going on? And so notice verse 25 of Acts 22. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? Very basically, he says the Roman law does not allow anyone to scourge someone who's a Roman citizen unless there has been the legal process that takes place which allows it. In this case, he is not condemned, has not been condemned. They were going to examine him. In other words, they were going to beat it out of him. And so he appeals to the Roman law. Roman law forbids this, so you better stop. If you skip down to verse 29, you see what happens. Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. And the chief captain was also afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, because he had bound him. See, it was actually illegal to even bind a Roman citizen with the intent to scourge him. That's why even the chief captain was afraid. He had had him bound. That was against the law. He could lose his life for that. What had Paul done? He appealed to the Roman system, the Roman government, for the protection that he needed in that scourging, so that he would not be scourged. And his appeal to the Roman government or laws afforded him that protection, and he was not scourged. Go a few chapters over to chapter 25 of Acts. They've had a change of governorship in that area. And this new governor, wanting to give the Jews a pleasure and be nice to them, asked Paul, will you go to Jerusalem to be tried there? Now, Paul had already been in Jerusalem once. He was arrested in Jerusalem, and that led to the situation we just read about. And then there was taking him into the synagogue, and they were going to question him, and there was a riot that broke out at that time as well. And then there was a group of individuals that were bound themselves together that they would not eat or drink till they killed Paul. And so the chief captain sends him off to where the governor resided. Now then, this change of governorship, and what happens? Why not go back there to be judged? And so Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. Now this governor could have said, Paul, we're going to go back there, and you're going to be tried at Jerusalem. Instead, Paul said, I'm a Roman citizen. And as a Roman citizen, I have the legal right to appeal to Caesar, and you have to send me to Caesar. You don't have a choice in the matter. Now, he wasn't too pleased with that because he didn't have any charges to write about. But he appealed to the law for his protection in that situation. Thus, we learn from that we do have the right to appeal to the legal system for our own protection. When you're in an abusive relationship, that's exactly what you need to do. You need to appeal to the legal system for your own protection. And yes, that means having the abuser arrested, letting him go to jail, getting all needed help that he needs to, but that doesn't give you the right to, from a God standpoint, to get a divorce. Now then, this might be a little bit controversial as far as a statement that I'm going to make on this regard. It might be necessary in getting the protection that is needed from the legal system to get a legal divorce, even though we recognize there has been no unjoining done by God. You're still married as far as God is concerned, but now then using that legal system and the advantages of that legal system to do what is necessary for my safety or the safety of children. So while it is not a reason for divorce, take advantage of the legal system to get out of that relationship, to protect yourself so that you are not done physical harm. The problem many times is very basic, that because of that abusive situation, the abuser feels free to be able to do it, and the abusive person or the abused does not, because of low self-esteem, does not take advantage of the legal system and turns around actually and starts protecting the abuser. You see that happening. In fact, I don't know if it's still the case, but it used to be that the most dangerous call that a policeman could make was a family situation that was abuse taking place. Why? Because they would get there, they would start to arrest the abuser, and the abused would turn around and attack the police then. No, take advantage, have enough self-esteem, take advantage of the legal system. Do what is necessary to get out of that situation for the protection that the law affords you. Now then, may a Christian marry a non-Christian? This subject oftentimes comes up, and we're going to deal with two issues in answering this, because many times the two issues, they're separate issues that are combined into one question. The first is, does God join together a Christian who marries a non-Christian? There are some brethren, many brethren, who say that God will not join them together. It is sinful. It's a sinful situation. In fact, in discussing with one individual, they said that there was a young man in their congregation who dated a non-Christian, and eventually and I'll use my term, they made him make a public confession of wrong for dating a non-Christian. The problem that they have to deal with is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 and 13. When Paul says, "To the rest speak I, and not the Lord, if any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman who hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him." The idea of put away and leave is a word in a marriage context that deals with divorce. So Paul deals with the husband and the wife, either one. They are married to a non-Christian. What do? They don't divorce. But if they are not joined together by God, then they would have to divorce. in order to be pleasing to God, they would have to get out of that sinful situation. They would answer, well, this is a situation where someone becomes a Christian after they've been married. Where's that in the text? It's just not there. I may agree that that's the specific situation that Paul was dealing with at Corinth, but he does not include that in this situation. All he says is, here's the fact of a man or a woman that is married to an unbeliever. What then? He does not deal with how they got into that state. He just deals with the state itself. The state is, you have a Christian who is married to a non-Christian. If it is a sinful state, then they have to get out of it. But obviously, he says, you don't get out of it. Therefore, it is not a sinful state. God has joined them together. And thus, it's almost, and some have gone to the extreme, that anyone who is a Christian who marries a non-Christian, they've got to get out of that. Doesn't matter how many years, doesn't matter anything, doesn't matter if they've converted their mate, they've got to get out of it. God never joined them together. When you go back to those groups or those classes as to what makes an eligible person, if their position is correct, you've got to add some things to that. And you've got to make it or take it away from a social situation to a religious situation. Marriage was for the social, not the spiritual. The spiritual, no doubt, is involved, but it is a social relationship. That's why two non-Christians can get married, or two Christians, or a husband and wife, a man and woman. As long as they meet those eligibility requirements, they can get married. And those eligibility requirements do not include someone who's a Christian. If it did, what about all of those marriages that took place prior to Christianity? What then? No, God joins those together in that bond of matrimony. But there's another question that's involved in this. More sensitive question. Should a Christian marry a non-Christian? In 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, and verse 14, it says, to be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion hath light with darkness? And he goes on to enlist several other incompatibilities. That these situations, the Christian with the non-Christian, is incompatible in their relationship. If a Christian's purpose, if his intent is to live faithful to God, to live that Christian life, to glorify God in all that they do, all that they say, to ultimately attain heaven's home, then the question needs to be asked, why would a Christian seek out someone who does not possess those same goals and that same purpose in life? That's a question that needs to be answered. We're not dealing with whether or not God will join them together now, but should they marry someone who is not a Christian? Someone asked me that question a few months back. It was at the back of the auditorium. And I just had a real quick quip to answer it. That if a Christian marries a non-Christian, it's not going to be long before they have difficulty with their father-in-law. Now then, I had to stop and explain that to them because it went over their head. What do I mean by that? The Christian is a child of God. The non-Christian is a child of the devil. Now then, Jesus stated in John 8 and verse 44 that ye are of your father the devil. Who's the father-in-law of those individuals? The devil. Or the father of those individuals? The devil. If they marry someone who's a child of the devil, who's their father-in-law? It's the devil. If you're a faithful Christian trying to live the Christian life and attain heaven, and you marry a non-Christian, you're going to have difficulty with the devil, with your father-in-law at some point in time. There are three major passages that people call upon dealing with specifically a Christian marrying a non-Christian. The passage we just read that we just read in 2 Corinthians 6:14 is one of those three. Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion hath light with darkness? Some individuals come to this and read it, and all they can see is marriage. The context of 2 Corinthians 6 is not marriage. You can read it, the entire chapter 6, the entire chapter 7. You got the entire context and more. It's not talking about marriage. Question is, does it apply to marriage? Well, it could. Say it could. But notice, if there is an unequal yoking, then could there be a equal yoking? The idea of an unequal yoking is that you've got two animals that you put a yoke on to pull a cart or to a plow or something. And one of them is doing all of the work and the other one's not doing any of the work. Because you've got two different types of animals and one's able to do it and one's not. An unequal yoking. But by the very nature of it, you could put two of the same type of animals, same type of vigor and strength and everything else, and there's an equal yoking that takes place. So if there is an unequal yoking, there must be able to be an equal yoking. If all marriages of a Christian married to a non-Christian is an unequal yoking, which is a position that a lot of brethren are taking now. If every time that a Christian marries a non-Christian, it is an unequal yoking of 2 Corinthians 6:14, then you need to consider verse 17. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. If every time a Christian married to a non-Christian is an unequal yoking, then in order to be pleasing to God, they must obey verse 17 and come out of that situation and be separate. But wait a minute, we just read a few moments ago in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in verses 12 and 13 where they were told to stay together. Thus you have Paul in 2 Corinthians 6 contradicting what he said in 1 Corinthians 7. If it is the case that every Christian married to a non-Christian is an unequal yoking, Paul must have, at least from 1 Corinthians 7, thought that there might be or could be an equal yoking in that relationship where the non-Christian does not overly affect the Christian in his Christian life. If that's not the case, then you have two incompatible passages. Stay together, you got to separate. Come out from among them. I really question whether 2 Corinthians 6:14 has reference to the marriage situation at all, even if it has any application to it. Now, I question that. Obviously, marriage is not the context. Question is, does it apply to the marriage situation? It could, but not always. A second passage that is often called upon is 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5, where Paul says, "Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas?" Thus, and this is, if you look at other translations, variously translated. Some of them have basically a sister who is a wife, and they make the wife being a sister, thus a Christian. And thus they try to conclude from that a Christian must marry a Christian, and that it would be wrong to marry someone who's not. But again, in reality, while this is discussing marriage, it's not a discussion of marriage. It's not discussing who has the right to get married. But there's a law of Bible interpretation that the authority for one thing does not exclude the authority for something else. We talk about the law of silence, and a lot of times we misuse that law of silence. There is a law of silence. Something that is not authorized is prohibited. But simply because God authorizes an action here does not exclude other actions. For example, in 1 Peter 3 and verse 21, "The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us." That authorizes baptism for salvation. If the authority for one aspect or one thing excludes everything else, then faith is excluded. Repentance is excluded. Confession is excluded. God's grace is excluded. The blood of Christ is excluded. And we could go on and on. It authorizes baptism, but doesn't mention any of these other things. Are they excluded? No. Why? Because the authority of one thing does not exclude something else. Now, and something else might be excluded. For example, we appeal to Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, and other passages that teach us to sing. And we say, because we have the authority to sing, it's sinful to bring in an instrument of music. Why? It's not because singing excludes the instrument. It doesn't. The instrument was never authorized by God in New Testament worship. Therefore, it is sinful. But singing and the command to sing, the authority to sing, does not by itself exclude the instrument. Now then, thus, even if, coming back to 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5, there is the authority for this action, marrying a sister, and it's really not dealing with marrying someone, it would not exclude marrying someone who's not a Christian. That would have to be elsewhere. But what's it talking about? The discussion that Paul is stating here is that he, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, being supported by brethren. And he's saying, in that support of brethren that I have the right to receive, I would also have the right to take along a spouse, a wife, on these missionary journeys that I've been engaged in, and for both of us to be supported by the church. That would be even including the wife receiving support of the brethren. That's what he's dealing with in this. And so he's not dealing with whether or not a Christian can marry a non-Christian, or whether even he could marry a non-Christian. It's dealing with the subject, I have the right to take a spouse along with me on my missionary journeys, and for us to be supported by the church. That's the discussion. And to try and take that and to use it in another way is really doing an abuse to what Paul is discussing here. The other passage that comes along is 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 39, where Paul says, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. First off, this is a discussion of widows. Would it also apply to widowers? In other words, men? Would it apply to one who has never been married? Those things aside, the key to the discussion here is the phrase, only in the Lord, or in the Lord, and its meaning. The majority of people, and if you'll read commentaries, even scholarly commentaries dealing with the original languages, will hold that this means only a Christian, and that she must marry a Christian. But the question is, or one of the questions is, where else does God command a Christian to marry only a Christian? Is this the only place? And again, we go back to the situation we were talking about earlier. If it is a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian, then what does that Christian have to do to repent of that sin? Repentance demands that we get out of the sin. But that again becomes a violation of chapter 7, verses 12 and 13. So while the majority of brethren, it seems like, and the majority of scholarly works apply this to marry only a Christian, there's another way in which we can understand it. And I believe the proper way. That it means marry according to what God approves. Marry according to God's laws. I would argue that the phrase, in the Lord, never specifically refers to a Christian. I see a couple of strange looks on that. I would claim that the phrase, in the Lord, never refers to specifically a Christian. But it always refers to an approved relationship or an approved situation of God. Let me give a couple of illustrations. In Ephesians 6 and verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. If the phrase "in the Lord" always means a Christian, then what do we have? Children, obey your parents who are Christians. Does that mean that if a parent is not a Christian, child doesn't have to obey that parent? Or if both parents are not Christians, they don't have to obey either one of them. Is that what it means? If "in the Lord" always means a Christian, then why wouldn't that be the case? Another illustration, Colossians 3 and verse 18. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as it is fit in the Lord. Does that mean only if they are a Christian? If the husband is not a Christian, does it mean that she does not have to submit herself to that non-Christian? Or do those phrases, and should those phrases, mean because this is what God commands, this is what God approves of? It's obviously, children, obey your parents because that's what God commands. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as it is fit because God commands it. This is the approved relationship or situation with God. But now then, go back to 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 39. She is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Going to have a little bit of an English lesson now. And the same would apply in the Greek language. So if you want to talk about it from English or the Greek, it's not going to make any difference. This is a phrase. It's a modifying phrase. There are two types of modifying phrases. There are adverbial phrases. There are adjectival phrases. An adjective, and thus an adjectival phrase, modifies a noun or pronoun. That noun or pronoun will then be called a substantive. An adverbial phrase, on the other hand, because it is an adverb, modifies a verb. Verbs being generally an action that's being taken. Now then, in the context and in the statement that we have here, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Is this an adjectival phrase or an adverbial phrase? If it is an adverbial or an adjectival phrase, then what is the noun or pronoun that it modifies? The only noun or pronoun here would be she, which is the widower. She must be the Christian then. It would have to apply to her, or the she in this phrase. She is at liberty to marry whom she will, and thus the she must be a Christian. That's the only noun or pronoun that is there. There is no other. What they have tried to do, though, is say, okay, this is an adjectival phrase, but it refers to the husband that she's marrying. The husband that she marries is not in the verse. It cannot be an adjectival phrase. There is no real noun or pronoun to which it modifies. It must be an adverbial phrase, modifying the verb married, or she is to be free to be married, or she is at liberty to be married. There's the verb, to whom she will, only in the Lord. And so if it is modifying the idea of marriage or the word married and thus an adverbial phrase, then it is telling how that action is to be done. The action is to be done according to the principles set forth within God's law. To take it and try to make it an adjectival phrase where it says that the person she marries must be a Christian goes against, whether you're dealing with Greek grammar, English grammar, it doesn't matter. It is contrary to the grammar that is in the verse. Now then, let me go back to the two illustrations that we used. Ephesians 6 and verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. You have two nouns that this could refer to. Children or parents. If it means a Christian, modifying the person, the noun or the pronoun. Children who are Christians, obey your parents. Well, that's obviously not what it means, and I don't think anyone would hold such. Children, obey your parents who are Christians. The parents have to be in the Lord. That would mean that they don't have to obey someone who's not a Christian. If you have two parents, they don't have to obey either one of them. That would be an adjectival phrase. However, it's an adverbial phrase, modifying obey. Children, obey your parents. Why? Because that obedience is right. It's what God has authorized or what God has commanded. Colossians 3 and verse 18. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. You have, again, two nouns, wives and husbands. Is in the Lord an adjectival phrase? Does it modify either one of them? Should we read this as wives who are Christians, submit yourselves to your own husbands? No. Or should we read it, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands who are Christians? No. Because it's not an adjectival phrase. It's not modifying a noun. It's modifying the verb submit. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husband. Why? Because that submission is what God has authorized. And thus that phrase, in the Lord, I don't believe you could find an illustration where it actually specifically refers to a Christian. Many times, if not most of the times, but many of the times, it would, what's the word that I'm trying to think of now? It would eventually apply to someone who is a Christian, if it's dealing with a noun or a person. But it's not specifically that meaning. It is an approved relationship. Who's in the approved relationship with God? If you're dealing with that, it's Christian. And so it might have that application, but that subsequent application, it's because they are approved of God, because they're in that approved relationship. Thus, when we come back to 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 39, that this one who has lost their mate, if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, according to the principles set forth within God's Word. It does not mean she must marry a Christian. Now then, should they? That's the other subject that we discussed earlier. Why would we seek out someone who's not a Christian? Is it sinful? No. You're going to have trouble, though. And generally speaking, the Christian will generally fall away. It takes a very strong Christian for them not to. Now then, you can just point out, oh, well, so-and-so, I know so-and-so, and they married a non-Christian. They didn't fall away. Yes, and it's been stated for every one that you can show that does not fall away, I can show you 10 who did. Why? Because evil companionships corrupt good morals. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. That's a general principle. Those who have never been married, those who are eligible for marriage, if you're looking for a spouse, look for someone who's Christian. Seek someone. And if they're not, then convert them. And then you can have that fellowship one with another, that spiritual fellowship where you're building up, strengthening each other to live the Christian life, to attain that heaven's home. But that one who marries a non-Christian, keep working on them. Be faithful yourself. One of the great problems is when the Christian doesn't really live a dedicated, consecrated life to God. And then why should the non-Christian obey the gospel? Be faithful in all that faithfulness means. If you're not a Christian, we would encourage you to become such, because there's an eternal destiny awaiting us of either heaven or hell. And the choice is yours. We want you to go to heaven. So obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. We don't want you to end up in that eternal torment of hell. If you're a Christian but have fallen away, you need to repent and come back, we would encourage you to do that. Let us pray with you for the forgiveness of your sins, because we want you to go to heaven and we want you to avoid that eternal torment.